First of all, you'll be delighted to hear that I won't be speaking to you for 1 hour, which is probably quite useful since we are running a bit behind time. But anyway, it is my very great honor and privilege to make this keynote speech, in particular because I'm coming to the end of my time in this part of the world. I've much enjoyed nearly 4 years in this region now, and I believe I've learned a fair amount about unique cultures, new peoples, at least new to me, fascinating histories, and indeed the past role of my own country, the United Kingdom, for both good and ill in this part of the world. I've certainly come to respect immensely the industry, growth, and ingenuity of the Asia-Pacific region. Today, I would like to address you on some very pressing issues of our time. I want to speak to you of industrialization, economic development and profit in the Asia-Pacific region, and the interrelationship of those endeavors with human rights, rule of law, and good governance. The discussion of that particular interrelationship will necessitate me making some observations on the Asian view of individual rights, and also the misplaced claims in some quarters about the social dangers of increased rights for the individual. Rule of law, human rights, and good governance are terms most often found in the narrative of development literature, although, of course, as laudable aims, they are not limited to developing countries. The principles which these terms encapsulate apply with equal force to developed nations too. In this time of economic crisis in Europe, the term good governance finds itself being called into question in relation to corporations and businesses. In particular, we see in the banking industry this to be true. In the United Kingdom, we are learning very hard lessons about sound national financial supervision and how this too is a major component of good governance of any state. Meanwhile, at an extreme level, where intertwined political and business elites of certain countries around the world extract wealth only for self-enrichment, independent, honest economic activity is subverted, and the result, in the end, is stagnation, often leading to a complete breakdown of social order and state institutions. Look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Zimbabwe, although we do see some small glimmers of hope now in Zimbabwe. But all of these countries demonstrate that economic and political mismanagement, beginning as personal enrichment by the governing elite, ultimately results in the collapse of the state, human rights abuses, and in some cases civil war, as in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a seemingly never-ending war bringing utter ruin to the people. It is true that in times of relative peace, human rights are seen as ideals and aspirations, contained in unenforced or unrespected declarations and international treaties, an expression of how we might wish the world to be if our better angels were at the fore. But when shocking images appear on our television screens of mass unlawful killings somewhere in the world, demands become increasingly vocal for the respect of our most basic human rights. And the cry often goes up when it is far too late. Look at Syria, for example. The Khmer Rouge Tribunal was established to address the murder or untimely death of nearly 2 million Cambodian people in the space of less than 4 years. A level of human extermination and suffering on a par with the Holocaust. Let us fervently hope that the Asia-Pacific region will never again have to confront these kinds of horrors, that the fate of human dignity and thus the success and peaceful advancement of society everywhere is preserved and respected. The example of Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, of catastrophic state failure and massive human rights abuses falls, of course, at the very extreme end of the human rights discourse. My message to you today is a more moderated one. It is that those values and principles which were so comprehensively abused by the Khmer Rouge have an equally important place in all the states across this region, which are largely enjoying peace and economic expansion, whatever their stage of development. The dominant discourse on human rights in the past half-century has placed great value on individualism, that individual men and women everywhere are the touchstone of value in society, and that the role of the state, as far as possible, is to create an environment in which the potential of the individual can be cultivated and expressed. To the extent that Asian voices have been heard in this debate, they tended to express concern at the misconception that the good of the whole is best secured by serving the good of the part, that the promotion of the individual risked marginalizing hard-won social order and cherished community values. And also importantly, that with rights come responsibilities. This is a valuable perspective for us in the West. Indeed, in Europe and the United States, politicians may pay lip service to the principle of individual responsibility, but a culture of stewardship is not ingrained into the state or corporate governance. We see every day the consequences of governance, banking, business, or commerce unfounded and unguided by those ultimate moral aims and values that in reality we all share, regardless of race, history, or religion. Long before the financial crisis in the West, Mahatma Gandhi stated that commerce without morality is one of the 7 deadly sins. And whatever excuses economists find for the mess we are now in, we know that banks in Europe and the United States have gambled with debt and played fast and loose with principles of decency and integrity. But I also need to be clear that a regional perspective of human rights cannot be used to justify repression or authoritarianism, nor should the promotion and extension of human rights be seen as a threat to the integrity of the state or government or business interests. A cultural relativist argument that custom is king hides the fact that it is victims' voices which are often unheard, and that, of course, certain basic sentiments and rights are as applicable in ancient Greece as in modern Asia. Naturally, states and those who lead them have an obligation to have regard to the particular interests of their society. Security, the rule of law, and social order must be balanced against human rights. But the balancing act must be done in good faith and with integrity and rigor, and not for personal or party interest or increase. Change makes people fearful. Enhanced, enforceable rights for individuals make many political systems very nervous indeed, for it can loosen the grip of social control. But it is worth reminding ourselves that history is full of wonderful examples of ideas or agendas which at one point in time were seen as revolutionary or disruptive of the social order. And yet, within a few decades later, those same ideas or agendas were part of the mainstream. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In 1909, in the United Kingdom, a working-class, self-taught Welsh lawyer had risen to the very highest levels of government. Imbued with the radical liberalism of the time, David Lloyd George, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Minister of Finance, presented to the British Parliament a budget to wage war on poverty. He had grown up amongst the poor. He knew about their trials better than any minister in the government. His mission was a very simple one: to bring some level of succor to the sick, the infirm, the unemployed, the widows and orphans. He questioned how the richest country on earth, hard to believe we once were so, could lay claim to civilization when many of its own people were living in abject poverty or even starving to death. The conservative establishment of the time, the landowners, the aristocracy of Edwardian England, loathed Lloyd George for his reforms. Many saw him in 1909 as a revolutionary intent on bringing down the social order of the day. But, ladies and gentlemen, by the time of his death in 1945, what were revolutionary reforms in 1909 was seen as the mainstream policy of all major political parties in the United Kingdom. Lloyd George said at the time that what was taking place was a quiet but certain revolution, as revolutions come in a constitutional country, without an overthrowing of order, without doing injustice to anybody, but redressing those injustices from which people suffer. Lloyd George had vision. He knew that his ideas and principles, unpopular and viewed with great skepticism by the British ruling class of 1909, would eventually become part of the mainstream and indestructible pillars of the British welfare state. This history teaches us patience, and also that in the long run, a few people with guts and vision can change things for better and forever. Lastly, on this point, we need to be vigilant too to the risk that concepts such as good governance and human rights can be misused by elements of civil society to promote self-serving agendas that undermine the principles on which the fragile system rests. I've seen this in my work. Such misstatement does much damage to the credibility of the human rights debate, and thus adversely affects the willingness of governments to shift position and pursue enforcement because they feel confronted by lobbyists who are not living in the real world. We have to live in the real world and get things done. As Sean has already said, it is a self-evident truth that sustainable commercial success can only flourish in countries committed to upholding human rights and the rule of law, where people are safe and secure, and where individuals know that their contracts will be enforced and their rights recognized in the courts. A study was done in 2002 proving the relationship between judicial independence in Hong Kong and the strength of her financial markets. Events expressing the judiciary's assertive approach to protect the rule of law, like the Court of Final Appeals decision in the landmark case of Ng Ka Ling and its subsequent clarification upholding the ruling, yielded positive average returns on the Hang Seng Index. In contrast, the reinterpretation request by the government relating to the same case and widely taken to indicate the executive's deference to higher powers was correspondingly associated with a negative return. Apart from having a skilled professional and managerial population, a keystone of Hong Kong's economic success is its commitment to the rule of law. Born out of a period of great political uncertainty, the Basic Law is a very impressive mini-constitution, preserving all the institutions which comprise the rule of law, and it has laudably enjoyed robust stewardship by an independent judiciary. Hong Kong now places 15 out of 142 countries on Transparency International's ranking on judicial independence, and is at the 91st percentile for the rule of law. Hong Kong has signed over 170 bilateral agreements, and the Hong Kong dollar, as you know, is now the 8th most traded currency in the world. The same story of success, unfortunately, cannot be told of all rapidly developing economies in Asia, where in some cases a mix of corrupt politics and a weak legal system and judiciary has allowed inefficient businesses to operate outside the law and left the population to needless poverty, disease, and suffering. The negative results of this combination are many, but the most visible is that increased economic expansion does not find its way to those who need it most. Lord Desai remarked that across Asian society, there is a very intimate relationship between business and government. Sometimes it is that relationship that has led to many problems in this region, but Hong Kong today is in a strong position to show how this intimate relationship can be harnessed to spur economic development, matched and supported by progress made in judicial independence and human rights. The Hong Kong government has always recognized the reciprocal interaction between good governance and economics, preserving the liberty of her citizens as eagerly as it does expanding trade with other countries. Hong Kong today has a liberalizing influence in this region, acting as a window to education and skilled managerial professionalism and a gateway to China's export markets. It can extend its influence too to encouraging good governance and protecting human rights, especially to a generation of Asian youth who are now very well informed and who are eager for change. Indeed, when speaking of the youth of this region and the thirst for change, one can see strong aspirations beyond these shores for the same success Hong Kong has enjoyed in upholding the rule of law and protecting human rights. The younger generations of the Asia-Pacific region are demanding accountability and transparency in government. And everywhere in Southeast Asia, we see calls for more robust protection of minority rights. The young want to speak freely, they want to express and communicate ideas, they want to be heard, and they want to affirm their membership of the body politic and to recall their governments to their duties and obligations. Just over a month ago, in Cambodia during the general election, it was the young who were speaking and rallying, and it seemed to me at least to be driving the political process. They want change, they want honest and clean business and government, and they want their rights respected. Of course, the reality of the law is in the details and the practical application in the courts. We know in a number of Southeast Asian countries, the economies are developing more quickly than the legal institutions. In some instances, their domestic legal systems need support, offered in the concrete, not in the abstract, support not just on the issue of human rights, but also in respect to very basic rights, judicial independence, separation of powers, proper application of legal procedure, and sound and consistent application of precedent. Only then will clean and sustained investment flow into countries with all the benefits that this kind of investment brings to the entire population. As Hong Kong moves into the future, its commitment to the rule of law will become more important than ever as Shanghai and other cities vie for prominence as the region's most prominent financial center. The independence of Hong Kong's judiciary and the confidence individuals and businesses have in the courts may well turn out to be Hong Kong's trump card and its living promise of the success of a clean government tied to a thriving economy. There are other areas of law and government in which Hong Kong can lead by example and can learn from the examples of others. For instance, demands for legislative reform and the need to continue developing a jurisprudence open to ideas from different traditions are challenges both Hong Kong and other Asian economies face as people become more aware of their legal rights and what can be achieved through the courts. Meanwhile, international law declaring universal human rights is influencing the development of the common law, and there is a correspondingly growing body of constitutional law in Hong Kong internalizing these international human rights norms. 2 cases arising in the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal in the last 7 years illustrate this very well, and recent scholarship has developed to reflect this area of growing interest. I think the lessons from all that I've said about human rights and commerce, about the Asian perspective of human rights and the rule of law, about the immediate fear of change or upheaval is quite simply to focus very calmly on a middle way, to allow the strident voices pulling to the extremes of these debates on good governance and human rights to be stilled for a moment, to concentrate on the needs and aspirations that bind individuals, communities, and institutions in reciprocal and mutually beneficial relationships. Good governance was not something that was dreamt up in the ancient city of Athens. It has distinctive Asian roots which can contribute to a robust human rights discourse proceeding on the basis of equality and respectful of the learning that diverse communities may possess at any given time. More than 2,300 years ago, the Confucian scholar Mengzi, a contemporary of Plato, was approached for advice by a prince who had sentenced a multitude of villagers to death for their failure to intervene in the defense of 33 of his officers who were killed in a skirmish, a particularly draconian case of criminal liability for a mission without possibility of appeal. It is impossible to put such a multitude to death, the prince mused. I'm glad he was at least a pragmatist. But then there is a crime unpunished of their looking angrily on at the death of their officers and not saving them. Mengzi admonished the prince in the following terms: in calamitous years and years of famine, the old and weak of your people who have been found lying in the ditches and water channels, and the able-bodied who have been scattered about to the 4 quarters, have amounted to several thousands. All the while, your granaries, O prince, have been stored with grain, and your treasures and arsenals have been full, and not one of your officers has told you of the distress. Thus negligent have the superiors in your state been, and cruel to their inferiors. The philosopher Zheng said, beware, beware, what proceeds from you will return to you again. Now at length the people have paid back the conduct of their officers to them. Do not you, O Prince, blame them. If you will put into practice a benevolent government, this people will love you and all above them. Let us be clear. This is no call to revolution, which would have been contrary to Confucian thought. Mengzi expresses the view that good governance is necessary for a well-ordered and harmonious society, because the government is the trustee of the people. The government needs to guard its trust. I would emphasize to you my belief that the advancement and enforcement of human rights everywhere must be pragmatic. I've said this already. We have to live in the real world. There must be concrete measurements of the benefit of the increase in individual rights. But such pragmatism does not need to limit aspiration. Let me give you another example of what I mean. Abraham Lincoln was the emancipator of millions of African American slaves. He laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the United States. And yet, while he acknowledged years before his presidency that human slavery was morally repugnant, he stated to a colleague 4 months before issuing the Declaration of Emancipation in January 1863 the following: "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union." From the perspective of 2012, we might question Lincoln's sincerity about squarely confronting slavery, the greatest moral challenge of the 19th century. And yet what this demonstrates is that Lincoln had to live and act in the real world. Whatever his personal views were, and from all I know about the man, he abhorred slavery. He had to choose the right moment to exercise his political will and abolish it. He had to find the right circumstances. And so too, in 2013, we must be pragmatic too. There is a right time for issues to be settled. And all states must recognize they do not possess a monopoly on best practice in human rights, rule of law, and good governance. Indeed, any claim that the West could historically make to moral superiority in the human rights discourse has long gone with the events of the last 10 years. And this does not mean advocating of a drift. Of course, we have to be robust and press ahead. But above the hue and cry that always surrounds human rights, good governance and the rule of law, we have to look at what can seriously be achieved and by when. And we have to provide clear examples of how human rights can have a beneficial impact on economic expansion and progress. Indeed, that is in the interests of states to adopt policies which in the end encourage honest business and government and provide a buttress against corruption and state mismanagement. Good governance, human rights, and rule of law all express the harmonious relationship between the individual and the government. Adherence to these norms over the long term actually protects individuals, communities, and government institutions from destabilizing social processes that can thwart the objectives of economic development and trigger the kind of mass violence the Khmer Rouge Tribunal now works to redress. It is a simple fact that in rapidly developing economies, without accountable politicians and businessmen, without functioning courts and independent judges, governance and commerce become so fraudulently intertwined so quickly that a great many parts of state institutions become completely corrupted. And the web of deception, bribes, and illicit profit, which grows, becomes so powerful that it's almost impossible to conduct any kind of business activity or change the political system for the better. It should come as no surprise that the United Nations and the international community focus transitional justice mechanisms on those who bear the greatest responsibility for atrocities, on senior leaders and those most responsible, or a lesson from transitional justice processes, that the individuals found to bear the greatest responsibility for mass violence will have tended to hold positions of authority in government or armed groups, the leaders, commanders, planners, and organizers who misuse the means and mechanisms of government to unleash terror on the population. Beware, beware. What proceeds from you will return to you again. I hope that in making these observations, it's quite clear that I make no claim to perfection of regulation, morality, or rights in my own country or region. We are all human. We are all susceptible to the same temptations and fall prey to the same human failings. But at least in countries with legally enshrined obligations and rights, with independent courts and judges, we can make claim to basic rights, and we can bring to firm and fair account those who are tempted and fail to meet their proper legal obligations. In the end, of course, we must get things done. We must dream, but we must dream what can be realized. We must encourage aspiration and listen to the voices of dissent. We must believe in a real paradise and a real earth in which men and women can live in the here and now and fulfill their destiny. I believe we can make life better and kinder and safer everywhere. We really can at this moment. I've seen in the course of my professional life a great deal of unneeded suffering. We all have. We see it today. Misery in many parts of the world is too near and insistent. Injustice is too obvious and glaring, and danger too is present. In acknowledging the imperfections of rights and obligations in the West, while trying to promote human rights in this part of the world, one becomes starkly aware of our reliance on each other. And I was interested to hear Sean in what he stated, actually making emphasis on this point, on the very real interdependence of rights and obligations in a globalized world. Banking fraud in Europe can create financial chaos here in Asia. Indeed, the financial crunch in Europe has significantly slowed the mammoth Chinese economy. So too, the failure to protect and enforce human rights in conformity with international standards produces dire consequences, spilling beyond national borders. Look at the never-ending Palestinian issue. Look at Syria. But in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, we must remain full of hope about progress and rights. Look at Myanmar today. Who would have imagined 10 years ago we would be where we are today in Myanmar? In talking about being hopeful, let me leave you with some words of Professor Howard Zinn. Professor Howard Zinn of Columbia University. And he said the following: "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It's based on the fact that human history is a history not just of cruelty, but of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so very many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of everything that's bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory." Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.